Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the ninth session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. I am Ishan Sharma and this evening we are joined by Professor Shuchandra Ghosh of Calcutta University. Before starting the lecture, I would like to give a small introduction of our speaker. Professor Ghosh is currently professor in the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture at University of Calcutta, with specialization in epigraphy and numismatics. She broadly takes interest in politico-cultural history of Northwest India, early India's linkages with early Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean Buddhist and trade network. She is a recipient of several fellowships in UK, France, and Thailand. She acted as sectional president, Ancient India section for the 80th session of Indian History Congress in 2019 and regional history congresses in West Bengal and Punjab. For he was awarded the Savitri Chandra Shobha Memorial Prize of Indian History Congress for the book From the Oxus to the Indus, a political cultural study in 2017. She is the area editor at the Encyclopedia of Ancient History, Asia and Africa. She has published two books and jointly edited several volumes. So today she'll be talking about the Indo-Iranian borderlands, deep Hellenism to fading imprints, 300 BCE to 100 BCE. Welcome to the session, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you, Ishan, and hello, everyone. Good evening. It's really a privilege to be here today to talk in this platform, and I'm thankful to Karwan Heritage Exploration Society, and particularly to Ishan Sharma for this initiative and for bringing me here. I'm really grateful, Ishan. And I really appreciate this initiative of these young minds because of this initiative we can listen to very important talks by various other scholars and get like during this lockdown period or when it's a trying time, so it gives us a very good feel of having into being interacting with other academics as well. Now, as you can understand from the theme of my presentation, that I'll be talking about the Indo-Iranian borderlands and Hellenism. So there are two players here. So one is the locale and the other is Hellenism. Now, this Indo-Iranian borderlands was actually a region which encapsulated the countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Northwest India. It was a focal point for travelers, for monks, for merchants, and for political personalities. Therefore, control of this region was very important, and otherwise also it was a very rich region. So I'll come to the maps and then I can describe the region itself. But let me talk a little bit about the politics of the region. And what we find is that from the very beginning, it is the Achaemenids who had controlled over this region. And then, of course, Alexander the Great, he started. He defeated Darius, and I think I would like to go to the PowerPoint. So, Ishan, how do I go there?
It is on the screen right now, so you can
go. So I want, yes, I can see it. Slideshow from the beginning. So this one. Can you put it into slideshow? Or I have to do that?
You have to. No.
Slideshow, Ishan?
Yes, yes.
Are you doing it for me? It's not happening.
Just a moment.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry for this technical glitch. And I think the connectivity is very slow. And so I just couldn't do it properly. Like it's not working. So Ishan is going to change the slides. And I'll just go on saying next, which is I'm not very comfortable with it. It's always better if you can do it yourself. But what to do, it's not working that way. So I began with saying that there are two players, and we are having the region and Hellenism. And when we talk of the region, we talk of the political powers who were controlling this region. And I was talking about the Achaemenids. The Achaemenids were very much in control of Bactria, Sogdiana, and that part of the time. And we know that after that, Alexander came and defeated Darius III and got control of over this region. So there's a very beautiful sculptural depiction. Ishan, first slide, please. So beautiful depiction of the defeat of Darius III at the hands of Alexander. And this is housed, as you can see, in Istanbul Archaeological Museum. It's actually a part of a sarcophagus. Next. So then after that, Alexander got hold of these regions of Sogdiana, Bactriana, and the region to the south of Hindu Kush, also the north and the south. Next. And then if we compare the Persian Empire and the Alexander's Empire, we see that the portion in the Iranian borderlands, which were with the Persian, the Achaemenids, they actually went into the hands of Alexander. Now, post-Alexander period, we had the Seleucids controlling this region. And then there was this governor of the Seleucid called Diodotus. He was ethnically Greek. Next. So the Greek ruler Diodotus, he formed this new kingdom, which is known as the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. So this whole region became very important for this new ruler. So he was ruling in Sogdiana, as you can see up here, and then of course the Hindu Kush, and then down in Bactria. And that moment started actually the rule of the Bactrian Greeks. And we have to keep in mind that generally the credit for Hellenizing Asia goes to Alexander, but we cannot forget the contribution of these groups of rulers, the Bactrian Greeks, and those then who were ruling in the south of the Hindu Kush, known as the Indo-Greeks. Next. Who had considerable control over this region and actually helped in the cultural acculturation or interaction between the regions. So when we see these borderlands, so here you have the regions like Paropnesadai, Arakesia. These are the regions which we have also seen in Ashokan inscription, which were at one point of time in control by Ashoka. So the Hindu Kush was actually the mountain which connected the region to the north of the Hindu Kush and the region to the south of the Hindu Kush. And there were a lot of passes in between. So through these passes, the merchants, the monks, the political personalities could move. So we know of the Khyber Pass, the Bolan Pass, but apart from these passes, there were a lot of other passes also. And it is very important for us to remember that this region was a region which was sans frontier. There was no frontier. So people living in this region were very close to the people to the north of the Hindu Kush. So there was, like, for example, the Yunta times, the pastoralists, they would easily move through these passes. And there were a lot of rivers because it's the region of the Indus, the 5 rivers. And so there people used to come in those regions, settle down with their pasture. And when the summer came, they again went back. So there was a kind of an interaction sphere, and there was no concept of a foreigner in this region. And there was a lot of interaction and intermingling between people of the two regions. This we have to keep in mind when we study the borderlands. Now, I will digress a little bit and talk about a person called, like, the discovery. When we talk about this region, we find that there were a lot of people who had come and ruled in this region, as I have mentioned earlier, and the Greeks were the main contributors. So the question that comes in our mind now is how much contact the Western Hellenistic world and indeed the Greekness, the Bactrian and the Greeks retained in these centuries, and that is the relating to the region. That is a very important question that we are dealing with here. And with this question in mind, Next slide, please. We come to the point of, this is another, of course, another map where I have shown the areas where we have the bearing the imprints of Hellenism. So these are there are different sites. Actually, today I'll be talking about three major sites. Iconium is one of them, but the other sites are Taxila and Arakosia. But apart from that, we have Charsada, which is Pushkalavati, and then Barikot and a few others, which are also very important to understand. But due to the constraint of time, I thought that let me focus on these three sites. Iconium is, of course, this gains the centrality. And then we have Arakosia, that is Kandahar. And then next is Taxila, which is also important for us. And it was such a site which is beautifully excavated and is linked with the Ganga Valley. So it's very important for Indian history also. Next slide. So now when we talk of Hellenization, the whole thing is that we all know that what is Hellenism? Hellenism is a particular way of life. And Hellenization refers, as you can read it in this slide, the spread of Greek culture and its adoption by non-Greek people. We know that there were a lot of work has been done on the concept of Hellenism, Hellenization, and others. And I'm not going into the details of that work. So, but we have Droysen, who pioneered the idea of cultural fusion between the Greek and the Oriental world, and then which took place in the then Hellenistic and Roman Mediterranean. So he introduced the word Hellenism to designate the civilization of the Greek-speaking world after Alexander. Next, please. And then when we talk of Alexander, we know that he could not transplant genuine Hellenism into Asia. By genuine Hellenism means exactly per se that was in the Mediterranean, nor could his successors. But we have some traces of Hellenism carrying the markers of the original, and that survived. So if we look at the survival of the markers, we find that from one place to another, in some, this cultural presence of Hellenism was intensified, and in other places it is attenuated. So as we move further east, so we find that we have much more of the markers of Hellenism in Iconium, rather we have in the sites of Charsada, Arakosia, or Taxila. But some of the markers are still there, and I will talk about how Herodotus defined. Next slide, please. Herodotus defined Hellenism. So the way Hellenistic way of life is introduced. So the main markers are writing tradition, artistic heritage, social habits, and religious inclination, among many others. Social habits is also a very interesting point. If I have time, I can delve a little bit on that. But here, what is important is that we can talk about or recall what Herodotus said, and because he was talking about Greekness, the Hellenikon, and he said, our common blood, common tongue, common cult places and sacrifices, and similar customs. So common blood, common tongue, common cult places are very important. And we shall see that when we look at these places, Iconium, Arakosia or Kandahar and Taxila, we find some of the markers are getting preeminent position, are more predominant than the others. In Iconium, on the other hand, we have most of the markers. But that doesn't mean that Iconium was a total Hellenized city. We had the local indigenous population also. But the most celebrated kind of Hellenism, or the most famous city in Central Asia, which depicted most of the markers of a Hellenistic city, can be found in Iconium. Next. Now I will digress a little bit and talk about Alfred Foucher. He was a leading figure of French archaeology, and he had, most of you know that his work on Gandhara, he had moved, like the way he tried to find out the Hellenistic presence in Gandhara in the Indo-Iranian borderlands. It's well known from his writings. But unfortunately, even he was moving along, he was working so much deeply into Afghanistan, he was not so lucky in tracing a Hellenistic city even after his long stint of excavation in the bulk area, that is the Bactria area. And for him, he thought that it was a mirage. Foucher was actually, he was obsessed by the memory of the Mediterranean Greek cities, and he wanted the stone-built houses, not the mud brick ones, and he was looking for those. And but he couldn't find it, and he got very frustrated. And we have a letter. He was written to Emil Senert. This is in 23rd January 1924, where Senert was the president of the Archaeological Commission in Afghanistan. And he writes, I quote him, like a hesitant traveler faced with a dissipating mirage, not knowing exactly where reality begins and illusion ends, I've come to doubt the testimony of my eyes. Unquote. He's talking about the mirage that is finding a Greek city. So this Bactrian mirage turned out to be true with the discovery of Iconium in northern Afghanistan. And how was it discovered? That's also a very interesting story. Next slide, please. The king of Zahir Shah, the king of Afghanistan, he was very fond of hunting. So once he went in 1961, he went on a hunting expedition in and around the region in Iconium, and he found this Corinthian capital. So this was the beginning of the story. So naturally, he informed the French archaeologist Rumberger, I suppose, who was working nearby. And then it was a fantastic thing happened. The whole city of Iconium was discovered, and it was initially the whole session from the late 60s, the excavation started, and it was Paul Bernard who excavated, who was the main leader of the excavation, along with many others. I'm very fortunate to have met Paul Bernard and hear many stories from him. Next. This is the town plan of Iconium. Now, Iconium, as you can see, it is situated like on one side there is the Oxus River, that is the Amudarya, and the other it is the Kokcha. It is the tributary of the Amudarya. So, and if you look carefully at this, the plan, we find that we have the theater with the propyla, then the mausoleum, the gymnasium, the palace, the arsenal, so the upper town, the lower town, and then you have the necropolis. So this layout shows that it was a perfect layout for a Greek city, and you have the markers of Greek civilization, the markers of Hellenistic civilization. And one thing I must mention here, this is for the students, of course, then when we talk of Hellenistic, we are talking about a period that is post-Alexander. So the markers of this, that each city should have a theater, should have a gymnasium, should have a library. So all these were found in Iconium. So the whole dream of finding a Greek city, a proper Greek city, was realized. And therefore, Iconium stands out as a most celebrated Greek city of Central Asia. Next. Now let us have a look at the site. And it is very unfortunate, we will show you that how this clandestine digging has completely finished. So this is one view of the layout. Next. And have a look at this. This is after the Taliban thing, the clandestine digging, and each and everything of Iconium was shattered. So the people who have worked there, they have told me that how disappointing it was when they went again and found that the site in such a position. Next. Now, to begin with, among the markers of this city of Iconium, the urban center of Iconium, we have the presence of the theater. Now, theater, we know, it attests to the Greek character of the city. And in this theater, the repertoire of Greek plays were performed. That can be understood. And it is very interesting to know that here, actually, this is the picture on your right is a virtual representation. Actually, the whole site of Iconome has been virtually created of the theater, how it would have looked like. And the capacity, the seating capacity and other things shows 4,000, more than 4,000, that it was larger than the theater in Babylon. So it is very interesting. And nearby the theater, we had from excavations this masks of slave cook and the fountain, the gargoyle, which was the gargoyle, the fountainhead has been found, which was very much, which shows that the new comedy was being played in these theaters, perhaps. And so the people who lived in Iconome were familiar with their with the comedy, that the Mediterranean cousins, and so there was prevalence of new comedy of Menander. And we know that when we look at new comedy, we find that they were trying to. Now, it is a satire, of course, in some cases of the Athenian society, and they were trying to. I'm very if we explain it in a very simple way, there are much to it, but the basic thing what I'm trying to say is that the chorus that we find in the old comedies, that chorus was not there. So it was replaced by small musicians, the band of musicians, playing music, and like this sort of mask swearing. So it was a kind of a satire. So we find that here we have this mask, but perhaps this idea of new comedy percolated further east. Therefore, in Gandhara, we have, during this period, we have representation. Next slide, please. This is actually just I was showing the Corinthian capital, the gargoyle mask and others. Next. Yeah, if you look at this slab, this is from a stupa from Hadda in Gandhara, Chokli Gonda stupa. You can see it's written. You can see that it's a very beautiful scene where it's a family scene, actually a sedate family scene, where you have a senior lady. She's carrying an amphora which has wine. The child is there. He is having the grapes, and then you have the men, and then you have the young couple who are playing music. So the use of musical instruments in the different plaques, different stone tablets and other things became very common in this period, in even to the east of the Indus, so in the region of the Gandhar. So this probably, I'm not sure, but to my mind, this was also the influence of the new comedy idea, where you have musicians and musical, instead of the large choir, it was replaced by bands of musicians. Next. Then from the theater, when we move into the treasury, we find that, and there is in the palace treasury, the palace, there was a library also. And in this library, we have found, like excavators have found, a fragment of a papyrus. And it was very carefully read. And it shows that it is a highly philosophical commentary on the Platonic theory of ideas, which belonged probably to the De Philosophia dialogue of Aristotle. So the whole thing, the fragment of papyrus shows that how this kind of intellectual activities were also being practiced, and it was kept in the palace library. So it was not at the easy reach of the people, but then it was being used by the elite class. And then we have a parchment also, and the manuscript of the parchment, I don't have the picture of the parchment. The manuscript of the parchment shows that it is a theatrical play. So this is very important, that we have a library in the palace. So the location is very interesting. And there were, in the palace, there were a treasury where other important things were kept. And we have wine jars. Actually, from the treasury, wine jars were big, wine jars and jars full of olive oil were found, which is very typical to the Mediterranean cuisine and Mediterranean way of life. Next. These inscriptions, I have got uh, one example of the inscriptions in potsherds. These are actually economic inscriptions. They talk about persons, and interestingly, we have names of the officers who are working, and they are all not Greek. Like we have names like Oxybazos, Oxydrakai. So they were there, and these were actually, they were keeping records of the transactions, the economic exchanges, and in some inscriptions, these are parts of the thing. We find reference to Kashapana also. So Kashapana, as you know, it was a unit of money in India. So it is in at that point of time, Pachmark coins were known as Kashapanas. So it is very interesting that it shows that there was link with the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. So you have reference to say 500 Kashapanas being given to somebody. So this examples show that kind of relationship Iconium had with the outer world. So on one side, it was the Mediterranean world, and we'll see gradually that how the people of Iconium were trying to replicate the life in the Mediterranean in their own life, in their own everyday life. And at the same time, it was not closed. It had relations, it had connections with regions to the east. Next. This is very important, which actually gives also the Greek character of the city. These are the set of Delphic maxims. This is the most revealing, as I have written, concerning Hellenism of the Greek settlers, which has been found in Iconium. And we know that this has been brought to Iconium by a person called Clearchus of Soli. He brought it here to be placed in this city. So the stone stele on which they had been inscribed preserves the final maxims of the series, and these read as, which is very important, it's actually a kind of a moral code of conduct. It reads as: in childhood, learn good manners; in youth, control thy passion; in middle age, practice justice; in old age, be of good counsel; in death, leave no regrets. So this maxims, these are the last lines of the maxims, shows that it served as a code of good conduct in Iconium, in the city. So this is a kind of a revelation, because the philosopher Clearchus of Soli, he was a well-known person in the history of the Aristotelian school. So he visited from Greece around the beginning of the 3rd century, visited Iconium, set up this monument, and of the copy of the Delphic maxim. I can show the original one. Next, please, Ishan. So this is the Delphic, and you can see the letters. It was written in very bold letters. And later on, we find that the writing becomes cursive. But this is the Attic style of writing Greek letters, which we find in Athens also. Next. This is another thing, not very good. Next. Yeah. Now, this is another very important part of Greek way of life, which is the gymnasium. Now, we know that gymnasium was very much a part of the daily life of the Greek settlers, the Hellenistic settlers. And it was not just only for having some kind of wrestling or some kind of physical exercise. Gymnasiums were a place where they exchanged ideas, they discussed, debated, and often disagreed, people there. And the beautiful layout of this gymnasium has been found. And it's not only, the whole complex was very interesting, because we have here not only the gymnasium, even a swimming pool was there. We find, and gymnasium also helps you, because when you look at the Hellenistic figures and Hellenistic art and all, so male beauty is also very important. And it is said that regular visit to gymnasium helps you to enhance the physical beauty. So it was a very integral part of a Greek way of life, and it was also a pastime. So here the gymnasium provided an entrance into public life. This was quite, as I mentioned. Then there were not only the piscine, which is the swimming pool, but there were large lecture halls. So, as I mentioned, the debates, the deliberations could be had there. And next, okay, let it be there, let it be just yeah, because I want to show you this figure Hermes. So here in the gymnasium in situ, an inscription has been found which was of two brothers, and Treballus and Straton, the two brothers, and it is dedicated to Hermes and Heracles. Now Hermes, in Greek mythology, in Greek, if you look at the Greek pantheon, Hermes was the god who actually helped in protecting the gymnasium along with Heracles. So the whole entire cultural idiom of how to protect in gymnasium, what should be the who should be there to protect, so is also replicated here. So we have this statue of Hermes being present in the gymnasium. And then we this bearded, sometimes he is beardless, sometimes he is bearded, and it is we find that it is generally in the Greek Hellenistic way of life. At the end of the period of their office, the gymnasiarchs, those who were in charge of the gymnasium, they generally dedicate this to the gymnasium. And so here we have such an example. Next, again, this is a layout of the gymnasium, and then this below we have the temple type, but I'll come to this later on. Next. Yeah, I would like to show you a few pictures of Heracles, because when we talk of gymnasium, Heracles was another person with Hermes, who was also very active, and he was a most coveted person in the Hellenistic among the Hellenistic youth and Hellenistic world, because of his valors. We all know that how Heracles fought with so many people, so many persons, and of course the Heracles fighting with the horses of Diomedes, that also we are aware of. So Heracles was a hero, and then from hero he was deified into god. So here in Iconium we have found this statue of Heracles. Next, you have different others like Heracles crowning himself, and this tallies well with the numismatic issues. If you look at the coins, we find that coins of Euthydemus, these are tetradrachms, we find that in some coins Heracles is seated on a rock, in other coins Heracles is crowning himself. So it matches the sculpture so well with this. Next. Another very important item that has been found, but I should mention that this has not been found during the excavation, but later on it came up into the market, but it's perhaps through clandestine digging. But it is believed that it is from Iconium. So it is a very interesting and important piece because it depicts Aphrodite. It was found in pieces actually, and it was restored in London. The whole scene, as you can see, composed of is three figures. So you have one Aphrodite here, you have Nike here, and you have Eros here. So Aphrodite is represented here, as you can see, semi-nude and seated on a pile of rock. The left hand is resting on the rock, and while the other hand is on her right thigh. She wears a hematon, which is a Greek dress, loosely draped around the lower part of the body, leaving the torso bare. The winged figure, this is very important. If you can see the Nike, she wears a chiton. So a sleeveless, and her wings can also be seen. A sleeveless chiton. She stands on a capital and holding what is probably a mirror. We are not very sure about it. And at the extreme left of the plaque, here you can see winged Eros stands on the same pile of rock as Aphrodite. and on which this is seated, and his right arm is raised while the other is making a gesture to unveil the hematum. So these are very interesting motifs that have been depicted in the in such kind of medallions or sculptures. We'll see some more in later. Next. This is a very interesting medallion that have been found by at Civil, and I liked it so much that I have used it as a cover picture of my book, and I thought of showing it to you. So this is completely different. It's a medallion which is gilded, and as you can see, you have the gold. You can see the gold color gilt, and here you have the sun, the moon, and the star, which shows the perpetuity of the medallion that is going to stay. And here you have the goddess Cybele. She is a Phrygian goddess and mother goddess as well. Cybele is there. She's riding a lion-drawn chariot. And here there is again Nike. And if you look at the dress, then you find that the figure, the dresses is absolutely in the Greek style. And it's a beautiful depiction of Greek art. And then you have the fig tree. The fig is also very important for understanding the Hellenistic ideas, because it is very typical of Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, we have the story that when Zeus was pursuing Gaia and his son Sicyus, yes, in the War of the Titans, in order to save her son, Gaia metamorphosed herself into a fig tree. So in different, even while honoring an athlete also, fig tree was used. So this is a very common phenomenon in Greek mythology. And so the use of these elements shows the knowledge of the persons, the people who are making it. So about the Hellenistic way of life or the Greek mythology of these things. So these are striking examples of the continuity of Greek tradition vigorously, which was followed in Hellenistic Bactria. Next. This is also a very interesting, I think I have a better photograph. One second. Mosaics. Next, please, Ishan. Yeah. So these mosaics have been found in the palace. It has been found even in the bathroom structures. So different kinds of mosaics have been found. Now, what is interesting is that these are pebbled mosaics which were used in Greece around the 4th century BCE. So in classical Greece, this kind of mosaics were being used. But what we find that after about 100 and 150 years in Iconium, well, in Greece, the type of mosaic changed, but in Iconium, the same type of pebbled mosaics continued, which shows they were trying, the settlers of Iconium were trying to keep alive the tradition which was there in classical Greece, and very much trying to hold to the traditions of the Hellenic world or the Mediterranean civilizations. Next. We have temples in Iconium, but in very bad condition. So, and interestingly, these temples are not Greek temples. You do not have a proper layout of a Greek temple in Iconium. You have this kind of ionic columns, or some portions, the Corinthian capitals or something like that. But you do not have a proper temple like with the now and the pronoun and all that we have in a proper temple or in a proper Greek temple. But what we have is that a melange of a Mesopotamian broad temple type, and then perhaps the deity was Greek or Hellenic. Next. So here you have this Mesopotamian temple type, this broad temple with podiums and all. I think, please go to the next, and I have explained this a little bit. It will be helpful for the listeners. So we find that its earliest phase belonged to the late 4th or early 3rd century. The temple stood on a raised platform, three-stepped podium, and it was set. The podium was set on a platform. Outer walls were decorated with indented niches. So it is actually called, the archaeologists called it temple on of indented temple, because aredon in French, indented temple because it has indented niches, and is an example of Mesopotamian broadroom temple type, as I mentioned, and were likely transmitted to Bactria by the Achaemenids and were thus absorbed into the local architectural tradition. So here, thus, though it is out and out, like it was very much the Hellenism or the Greek way of life was very much pronounced, we had the local traditions, we had the Iranian traditions also coming in. So the temple yielded a diverse selection of artifacts and equally diverse range of cult practices, perhaps, because burnt offerings, libations to the earth, and dedications of statues were found. Interestingly, a sandal has been found. Next, please. Yes, this is part of a statue, and if you look at the foot is very there is a sandal. It's a sandal actually. The foot is wearing a sandal, and if you look at it, it's giant. So therefore, we can imagine it is perhaps the deity, the cult figure. And this is, of course, part of imagination. We do not have any proof. The scholars, those who have worked on it, could not prove that way. But it shows that perhaps in this broad temple type, the deity was Greek. So this is a kind of an idea which is being explained by the excavators and other persons, scholars who have written on this. Next. We come to, I don't have a picture of the houses, but domestic architecture is very important when we look at site. And then we find that in the architecture and decor of the houses, it is predominantly Greek. But very strangely enough, we do not have any banquet hall, which is very much a part of a Greek household. So why we do not have a banquet hall, we don't know. But there were like porches and big halls and other things. But apart from those, there were also modest habitation spaces where resided perhaps the not so rich people. And naturally, the plan of these houses differed. So some of the houses shared one or two features with their aristocratic neighbors, like the porch. Like porch has been found in localities where not so rich people lived. In other quarters, we have the less privileged people, and that is evident from the domestic kind of architecture. After the UHE invasion, like the nomadic invasion in Iconium, I must mention that Iconium was destroyed by around 145 because we have Eucratides' first coins last issued from there. But it has been seen that the houses were still being used, and perhaps quarters and all people were staying, the locals were staying there in later, and it has been further research has shown that. Guy Lisiot has published a volume on the domestic architecture and the houses of Iconium. Next. This is also a very interesting find from Iconium, where we have this. This is a disc made of shell, and you have embellishments and embossments, and also like there are different kinds of stones which were put in this. In the small, there, for example, there's a leaf, there is the buds and other things. So it is beautifully done, and it has it is made of shell with encrustation of stones. Next. One thing I would like to mention here, that there, when you had this the disc which I showed you a little earlier, so there were this plants, then a beautiful lady and others. So there is a tendency of scholars calling it that perhaps this is the Shakuntala plaque. But I would like to submit that just having deer and trees and a girl doesn't mean that it was Shakuntala. It could be anything. Now, so when we look at it, that it is recognized that the material culture and the architecture remains present, that which I have shown you is as an eclectic range of cultural influences in Iconium. So there were obvious statements of Greekness, then flexibility in cultural representation also. So it is not actually celebrating Hellenism, but at the same time, we cannot ignore it. So we have to recognize its presence in Afghanistan along with other cultures. So therefore, the literary texts, the economic inscriptions, of the treasury, the gymnasium, the theater, and all the materials unearthed from the site carry the distinctive imprint of Hellenism. Hellenism, which was, so we can say that it was the hallmark of the city, and the settlers were more influenced by the art and artistic tradition, which I mentioned when I talked about the mosaic of classical Greece. And they were trying to to present the Greek identity. So the Greek identity was actively perpetuated and remained and asserted through the epigraphic evidence when you have the writings in Greek and other things. In later on, we have a lot of Greek inscriptions. But if we look at the later things, we find that full-fledged Greek identity is difficult to think of. So there was a mode of interaction, and we have to remember that this mode of interaction was accommodative and not conflicting. So there was this zone, actually, this whole, we'll see also later, it was a pluralistic society where you have a lot of accommodation and adaptations. Now, next slide. Now I will move to Kandahar, Arakosia. And we all know that Arakosia was within the political control of the Achaemenid Greeks, Seleucids, Mauryan, Greco-Bactrians, and Indo-Parthians, Indo-Scythians, and finally the Kushans. So Alexander named Kandahar Alexandropolis, which controlled the main road between Iran and India. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, that Iconium, what was the Iconium means, it's a local name. It means Lady Moon, Oikanom. It's also said Oikanom, Lady Moon. And what was the original name is not known. Paul Bernard, who was the excavator of Iconium, he believed that it was the Alexandria in the Oxus, which Alexander mentioned. But we are not very sure about it. Next slide. So when we come to this, we find that these sites do not have the kind of cultural markers or the grammar that Iconium had. But in their own way, they bore the imprint of Hellenism. So this is a closer map of Arakosia, Kandahar. You can see the location. The location is very important because it was accessible from the Iranian world, like Drangiana, and you can see on your left, so Parthia, this is the Iranian world, and also the Indian world. And moreover, it was also accessible to the Oxus territory. So Kandahar Arakosia was a place where you have lot of it's like a crossroads. You have a lot of interaction which could actually take place. But unfortunately, we would like to have perhaps a lot of material which bore the imprints of Hellenism from Arakosia, but unfortunately we do not have. So here we have that it was a Greek city is no undoubted, because when we look at the Ashokan inscription, next slide please. Yeah, when we look at this is the bilingual Ashokan edict. When we look at it, you have the Greek and the Aramaic, the bilingual one. So since the people, the locate was reading Greek, so it prompted Ashoka to write his inscription in Greek. But later on, the period when I'm talking about, Then also we have an inscription, which is a Greek inscription found from Kandahar. Next slide, please. This is a very beautiful photograph, and I thought that I would share with you. It's from the British Library, and 1881, showing the ruin of the old Kandahar citadel, Zorshar, where the second Greek edict was discovered. This second Greek edict actually talks about a dedication. It is by the son of a person called Aristonax, and it is a small couplet kind of dedication, but it's important because it's in Greek. Next. Here you cannot, it's very difficult to understand, but the inscription is here. Here, I think if you can look carefully, you'll find the Greek letters. This is another which Paul Bernard published. This is from Kandahar, which shows the imprint of the kind of, this is found, the figures actually have the imprint of Hellenism. This inscription which I'm talking about, the son of Aristonax, this is interesting because Aristonax is a pan-Greek name. So here you have, and the writings are very much similar to that we found in Iconome, in the dedicated inscription of Tribalus and Stratos in the Gymnasium. So these were very close, kind of, the writing style was very close. Another interesting point why Kandahar is regarded as that there were a lot of Greek population, we find from a later, not much later, of Isidore of Charax. The book is Stathmoi Parthikoi, the Parthian stations. So it gives you an account of the places which Isidore of Charax visited. And there, when it comes to Arachosia, comes to Kandahar, it says that it's Leuke, India, and Esti de Hellenes. So Leuke, India, which means white India. So the people of the local people were white. So there must have been a substantial Greek population in Kandahar. But the most striking inscription that has been found from Kandahar, and it's not very far away time that it has been found. It's almost, I think, around 2000 this was found. So this inscription is, next slide, please. Yeah, this inscription is a very interesting inscription because it is written by a person called Sophitos. And the background is, I'll read the inscription, then you come the translation, which has been done by Paul Barnard. It shows that the kind of awareness this person had of Hellenistic way of life. Next. So it says that it is, this is actually a mausoleum, and the background is that this person, Sophitos, he lost his house and then he rebuilt it, and then he wanted to tell everyone that how he has he got funding, how he amassed his wealth, and how he is doing it. So let me read it for you. For a long time, the house of my forefathers was flourishing when the irresistible fury of the three Morii destroyed it. And I, quite young and deprived of the wealth of my family, I, unfortunate Sophitos, scion of the family of Naratos, who had, and please mind the name, Sophitos Naratos, who had cultivated the arts of Apollo, the archer, and of the Muses, together with the virtue of wisdom, I considered how to restore to a new grandeur of my ancestors' house. Having borrowed money to make it fructify, I left my country, determined not to return before amassing a great fortune. Therefore, I took to commerce and to many cities. I accumulated great wealth without suffering any harm. Here I am, having returned after innumerable years to my fatherland, among such much praise and amid my friends rejoicing. And at the same time, I have reconstructed and beautified my ancestors' house, which was dilapidated. And since the family tomb had fallen to the ground, I rebuilt a new one. And I had this stele erected next to the road so that it will speak thus: Look at my accomplishments, well worthy to be imitated. May my sons and grandsons preserve the house which they owe to me. Sophitos, son of Naratus. As it is, it's a beautiful inscription. But there are very important factors here. Uh, it shows that he were educated in the Greek way of life. So he uses the archer for Apollo, the irresistible force of the Moirae. Moirae are the three goddesses of death. Uh, are phrases familiar to any person aware of Greek poems. Sophitos clearly states that he has received Greek education. He has not only read the poets, but even practiced poetry. So, in the and he visited many. Unfortunately, he doesn't name the cities. But to my mind, if we look at the time frame, uh, around first century BCE, second end of the second and first century BCE, if you look at the time, then at that time the Silk Route was also active, and perhaps he went on a business mission. But this is, of course, my imagination. And he must have crossed northwest India, and we know that there were routes which linked the Indo-Iranian borderlands. To that we have a solid proof about it, and not a fact of imagination, which would linked with the Silk Road. So it could so happen that he participated in a larger network of larger network of trade, and so otherwise he wouldn't have been able to amass such wealth. And so by trade he got it. So what is interesting is the name. The name is Sophitos, which might come the Paul Bernard and Rougemont. They have Rougemont, sorry, they have studied the inscription, and they feel that Sophitos could come from Shobhuti, and Naratos is a name which is not found in Greek, so it could be from Narada. So whatever it is, there was a kind of an Indian presence in the names which they feel. But interesting is also the reference to many cities, which Paul Bernard thinks that it reminds us of the first verse of Odyssey, and to the man of 1,000 tricks who visited the cities of many men and knew their mind. So visited the cities of many men. So the way this was being used in this inscription is quite remarkable. So this shows that though in Kandahar we do not find a gymnasium, we do not find a theater, but the presence of the Greeks, the Hellenistic presence, is very much articulated through these inscriptions, which were written in Greek, and the people were also embracing the Greek way of life, or they were Hellenized in some way. Next. Now, if we look at the excavations that have been done in Kandahar, British White House, we know they've done. So it's we find that the Greek occupation represented a mere accretion on the pre-existing settlement, a colony implanted in a flourishing Achaemenid native city. So the material remains, as I mentioned, there was very little which could be termed as Greek or Hellenicon in comparison to Iconium. There were some domestic architectural findings which indicate a Hellenistic character and can be compared with the unquestioned Hellenistic style of objects that have been found from Iconium, but otherwise we do not have much to talk about. So here we find that Herodotus's idea of Greekness was mostly absent, except for a common tongue. So this common tongue becomes the main instrument for identity, and it shows that perhaps that the settlers, there was no desire or no effort on the part of the settlers to build up a common identity which will mark them as distinct from the indigenous population. So to have a gymnasium or a theater was not in their mind, perhaps. But having said that, a lot of excavations remain to be done. So we cannot have anything conclusive on this. Next, the third destination. Our third destination is Taxila. I'll go through. I know time is running out. So Taxila, we know that there are 3 stages. So we have Virmount, then Sirkap and Sirsuk. Sirsuk belongs to the Kushan period, Sirkap to the Indo-Greek and the Indo-Scythian, Indo-Parthian, and Virmount for the Mauryas. Next map is important for us. Next, yeah. Now, if you look at this map, it is a map of Uttarapatha. I've taken it from Jason Mills' very important book on the trade routes. So here you have Taxila. So Taxila was actually was linking Uttarapatha, and then finally Taxila was also going to the west. So it's a very important location, which helped in the growth of such interesting urban centers that we find in Taxila. But here too, the same, we do not have and like Kandahar, there was inscription, but in Taxila, not a single inscription has been found which is written in Greek. So we do not have any Greek inscription. We do not have a gymnasium. We do not have a theater to say. Then what do we have to identify it as a partly that there was some influence of the Greeks, and that is the layout of the city. Next. This walls actually shows that, because one other important thing was it was linked with the, as I mentioned, but from the Doab to Taxila, it was the shortest possible route, and then from to the west. So a lot of influences or interactions happened, and it had come into this place. So if you look at these walls, then these are like the huge rampart walls, which are similar to that we find in Iconium. Next. The city was destroyed and rebuilt several times, but even then, with many transformations and other things, individual buildings, the layout remained, the Greek layout remained intact, and it is well preserved till the latest day of the Greek occupation. And this is just a general idea. So you can see the grid pattern, that how it was, the layout was then there. Next. Then this is again, this is the part of a temple where you have this ionic pillars, and then this again the layout. One thing I should mention here, that when scholars were talking about that layout, which is perhaps taken, most probably it is believed that is taken from the Greek pattern. But like, for example, Gerard Fussman, he said that if someone comes from Central Asia, he will not be very at home in Taxila, because the houses were very cluttered, very close, which is not there, not not the question, not in Central Asia. The houses are much more open up with the open courtiers and other things. So therefore, though there are remnants of it, shows the pattern, the rampart wall and the Greek pattern is very much taken from the Hellenistic ideas, but the layout of the houses and others are of course very much local. Next. Very interestingly, in Sirkap, before I go, I just, another point about the houses is that the rooms were very packed. So one does not see in Sirkap the columned porticos that we find in Central Asia. So this was the reason why Gerard Fussman said that people will not be happy here when they look at this look at the central places. The classical literature also, before I come to this image, let me just tell you that the classical literature also is not very vocal about Taxila. We do not have much. Only we have Vita Apolloni, that is the Apollonius of Tyana, who has written on Taxila, and that was during the time of Phrautes. He is an Indo-Parthian ruler post Gondophares. So he talks about Taxila, and he describes that it was the Apollonius of Tyana. He describes that it was very much a Greek city. The ruler spoke Greek, and there were sages who spoke Greek. So there was, so from that Vita Apolloni, from Apollonius of Tyana, we have some idea that perhaps the traces of the Hellenistic element remained. But what is interesting is that we have among the artifacts some stone artifacts which are known as toilet trays or cosmetic trays. I'll show you a later picture which will make you understand that why they are said cosmetic trays. Now, this toiletries or cosmetic trays have been found, and lot have been found from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century CE. So we have these even in the during the Kushan times, the Indo-Scythians, Indo-Parthians, and even in the Kushan times. They're taken to be a category of artifacts which documents iconographic themes, which is very important, typical of a refined court production. I have written elsewhere on this that how the elites of this region were embracing the Greek way of life, and how these toilet trays it was produced by order, it was custom made, and how they were using it for their own use, for their own luxury item, and also remembering some of the myths or some of the poetries that were prevalent in Greece. So when we look at these toilet trays, we find that the earlier trays from the Indo-Greek period, we have representations of literature in this. But when we look at those of the Indo-Scythians or the Indo-Parthians, they are very functional. They are only depicting the persons, but no stories or no Greek mythologies are being represented here. Now this one is very, if you look at the caption, this Apollo disrobing Daphne, these are very interesting epigrams, very interesting themes that we find in the literature. And so these themes were being replicated here. So perhaps the patron, the elite, he asked his the person, the sculptor, or who made it, to actually replicate this, and gave him the story, or he knew the story, whatever. So there was this attempt on the part of this client and the clientele to the patron to have it custom made for their own benefit. So next. Then again, this is taken from a book. Actually, this is a toilet tray which represents a banquet scene. So this scenes are very much Hellenistic. I'm not going into the detail. Next. Okay, just go back to one slide. One more. Okay, this Apollo disrobing Daphne this is one, but there are other kind of depictions of this site. So if we it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where you have quite a collection of this. So the same theme is being replicated in different, or represented in different ways. So the images are very important here. Next. Next. This is go one slide earlier. So this is the Indo-Scythian layer, from where you have the silk cup, you have the very functional tray. But here you can see it is that people are holding cups, obviously wine cups, and just they're there. There's no story, there's no literature behind this. Please go back once more. Yeah, this is the functional use. You can see the two holes. Two cups actually, and these have been tried in a laboratory, and they have found remnants of powders which were used perhaps for makeups and other things. So this very toilet tray shows the functionality of these stone artifacts. Then forward, please go forward. Yeah. This is again Aphrodite, which I was discussing here. So Aphrodite chastising Cupid, Aphrodite is also very important in Greek literature, Greek mythology, Greek poems. And here again we had from Iconome the representation of Aphrodite, and here again from Sirkap we have this kind of images. So this shows the importance of the literature which was there in the mind of these Greek elites. Next. Then we come to the jewelry. And if we look at the jewelry, the technical things, the technique of granulation and filigree had perhaps come from the Greeks, because here in Taxila, there were a lot of jewelries been found which were using the granulation technique and the filigree work. And Pierre Callieri thinks that there were artisans who moved from Alexandria, who moved from different places, came here, and these were being produced locally. So these are not imports, produced locally, but with the technique which was learned from the Hellenists, because these people, when there was movement, so they had come along with the others. So there were movements of craftsmen, there were movements of merchants. The craftsmen stayed, they produced, and so we have such beautiful. I have some more. Next, please. So here you can see the beautiful jewelry, the granulation. Next, earrings. This is from the Alami photo thing, but you can see the kind of jewelry, the earrings, the necklace that were being found in Sirka. These are all gold jewelries. Next. Then this is the famous temple, the Eagle Stupa, which is there. Next, and just quickly, it doesn't have much to do. This satire is very important for our theme, because here we have the representation of a satyr. If you look at the face, it's very dynamic, and you have the contracted eyebrows and open mouth, which suggests the school of Pergamum. And this has been found from Sirka. It's not from Mykonum. So this shows that sculptors, artists had actually come and they were being trained in the Hellenistic way of life. So these had some kind of the representations of the sculptures. Then in Taxila, we have also representation of the use of semi-precious stones like carnelians and others in the jewelries. So all these make the Sirka period of Taxila. There were many other objects. For example, the objects of utility. They had a very much strong Hellenistic influences. Eros perhaps is represented, then finger rings and others. So all this shows that how Taxila and Sirkap had a very strong Hellenistic influence in the production, in the everyday utility things. But the general markers which Herodotus was so proudly proclaimed by Herodotus. But we have to remember that this was not universal, that what he said, but the proud proclamation that common tongue, common blood, common cult and all, this we do not, the gymnasium and all that, we do not find here. Next. So I'm actually at the end. I have shown, this I have already shown. Next. Yeah, finally. So finally, what we find from what I have discussed here, till now, I have left out, as I mentioned, two important centers. One was Charsada, which is Pushkalavati, and the other was Barikot in the Swat Valley, which also had imprints of Hellenism. It is there in my book, but I preferred not to discuss here. So the whole gamut of the archaeological materials that we see founded sites indicates that there were multi-pronged linkages, of which the Central Asian connection played a very significant role in the shaping of the culture of the region. And it is the Indo-Greek period which played a very important role in helping this interaction thing. And Hellenistic tradition, the transmission of the Hellenistic tradition in Northwest India, which was accommodated, and very active trade route was also there. And what I'm trying to harp upon is we have to think of a pluralistic society. We have to think of that in early India, in Northwest, it was a regions of frontiers. It was a society where there were multi-pronged linkages, multi-pronged influences. And so it is not a melting pot. It is, I would rather say that everyone kept their own identity alive, but there were inputs from various cultures. So all said and done, you can read here, being a recipient of multidirectional influences, Indo-Iranian borderlands should be treated as an independent cultural zone where, though Hellenism retained its cultural presence, we had various influences pouring in also. The local tradition was not altogether forgotten, and hence there was only imprints of Hellenism and not Hellenization. So therefore, we have to, it was there, we have to celebrate pluralism, we have to celebrate hybridity, and we should not say that it is a unilinear. Our society was never unilinear, and I always feel that when you are in a zone where which has multiprone linkages, which is very open, so there has to be interactions. And as I mentioned earlier also, it was accommodative and not conflictive, as our sources mention. Thank you. Next, thank you, slide. Yeah. So this slide is important because I was talking about the band of musicians who were very much present in the new comedy and who were depicted in Gandhara. So here you have, in the small panel, you have a band of musicians playing, so for example, playing flute, cymbal, and many other things. So I would like to thank you all with this note that music and literature, culture, these are all very important for us. And we have to stick to all these things for a good life. Thank you. Thanks for patiently waiting and hearing.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am, for this amazing lecture, very engaging lecture. So we have got some questions in the live chat. Let me take,
I
or
think I have taken a lot of time. But
no worries.
yes, at least one to questions I would love to engage in with.
There is one question by Gopal. Kash, Karshapan coins are supposed to be from Magad. How come these are found mentioned in Iran-related texts?
Yeah, that's the beauty of the thing. Karshapan, when you have reference to Karshapana, which shows that there were interaction. It is not Iran. We have to remember this is Afghanistan, north of the Oxus. Ai-Khanum was located in north of the Oxus. So it is in the Afghanistan area. And this shows the linkages. So maybe some loan was taken because these are economic inscriptions, and it has to be, so the monetary transaction was in Karshapana. So it was with the Magad region or the Northwest India. There also Karshapana was being practiced. So
So
this
that's very
shows
interesting.
the interaction sphere of Ai-Khanum.
So the next question is from Prasanjit Mukherjee. He asks that what was the impact of economic activity of Ai-Khanum on Indian politics and economy at that time?
No, not much, as I should say, because economic activity, Ai-Khanum is mainly whatever information, the archaeological remains that we have found from Ai-Khanum, it shows it's mainly celebrated as a cultural thing. But we have the economic inscriptions, but they don't talk about much about the political impact in Northwest India. And interestingly, I'd like to mention that though they were contemporary to the Mauryas, but they don't mention the Mauryas. We have no mention of the Mauryas. On the other hand, they mention the Nandas. So the Nandas were gone by that time. But when they're mentioning Kashapana, they're mentioning Nandas, and perhaps this could be linked. This is a hunch. I do not know, because we were all searching for this answer, those who are working on this. So it could be that, just as I mentioned, that Ai-Khanum was relying on the classical Greece, the 4th century Greece. So they were looking back. So perhaps they had some information on the Nandas, whom the Mauryas, Chandragupta Maurya, as we all know, displaced. So perhaps this idea of Nanda was in there. They were talking about the Mauryas, but the name Nanda was in their memory. So from the memory, they were writing Nanda and they were using Kashapana. But Ai-Khanum did not have much political interaction with the Indian subcontinent.
So Somrita's question is, what are the similarities and dissimilarities the archaeological materials show in the way of everyday life between Takshila and the city in the Indo-Iranian borderland?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. Actually, if you look at the Takshila also, when we look at Takshila, so we have these different time frames different, like Sirkap, Sirsuk and all. So if you look at Sirsuk, it is completely different. Kushan period material is different. But if you look at Sirkap, then we find that we have certain, I didn't mention all this because time constraint, there are many from the excavation sites, many objects have been found of daily life which had a very strong influence of the Hellenistic West. For example, Megarian bowls, different kind of bowls, or the handle of a jug which had a beautiful eros in it, or wearing the jewelry as I mentioned. So therefore, in other places, Taxila, and we have much more better report of Taxila. We have a lot of people, even after Marshall, we have people working. Cunningham has worked on it. So they are actually looking for the craft, that how the craftsman space of the craftsmen were there. We have this kind of work going on. So in the everyday life material, we have some ideas which can show that there were some influence. And but remember, this is from the elite, not for the ordinary people. So we have to, when we work on everyday life, we have to differentiate between that what are the sources. When we look at sources coming from the elite, then the everyday life will be different. And source, if we have sources like, for example, the different, because we have lot of potteries, common potteries, Ganga Valley potteries there. So these were also used by the people, but the elites had a different kind of everyday use.
So this is this question by Professor R. Mahalakshmi ma'am. So her question is, since you refer to deep Hellenism, could you refer to the material influences that may have abided even beyond this period? This seems to be hinted when you say finding fading imprints.
I actually, when I talk of deep Hellenism, I'm talking about the cultural part mainly, not much of the material remains, because we do not have much of the material thing, like Iconum excavation. We have Iconum from the treasury. What we get mainly from the treasury, different kinds of potteries and other things. But the kind of material remains that we find in Sirkap is not there. So when I talk of deep Hellenism, I should have cleared it in the beginning. It is mainly from the cultural point of view. So Hellenism here means the kind of life, Hellenistic way of life that was being pursued by the people of Iconium. And fading imprints in the sense that when I talk of Kandahar, when I talk of Taxila, when we don't have those cultural markers. For example, we don't have Kandahar, we cannot say because not very much well excavated, but Sirkap, Taxila is well excavated, but we have not found any gymnasium, not found any theatre from Taxila, which shows that the imprint of Hellenism, the cultural imprint, is fading. It was not important for the people who were living there to have a gymnasium or to have a theatre. It was not a part of their everyday life. So that is the difference. So my approach is from the cultural point of view rather than the material objects.
Yeah, so there is this follow-up question by her that, can you speak a little on the imprints that may be there beyond the immediate political and cultural context that you are talking about?
Yeah, we can actually, if we talk of imprints, then we have to categorize, like there are some ways of looking at. So if we look at, for example, the different kinds of potteries we have. So there are a lot of fish bowls, bowl à poisson in French, they translate it like that, the fish bowl type, which is a very much Hellenistic pottery that has been found in Iconium, that has been found in Pushkalavati. Then there is called the Megarian bowl. So these have been found. And then in some cases, the different kinds of utensils, apart from the bowls, that also shows that there were definitely impact. And then when we talk of material remains, the pottery, the vases that have been found from the treasury of Iconium, that vases containing olive oil itself is a very interesting phenomenon, because it is perhaps used also, it is very since it's kept in the treasury, it means that it's a prized item, but its presence shows that it was used in the daily everyday, maybe the cuisine of the elites. So it has to be kept the royal because it's in the treasury of the palace. But it shows that there were this kind of imprints. So I think ceramic is one area where we can go deeply, study deeply, and show the imprints. I strongly believe that the kind of imprint which I'm trying to say, it's will not find in the ceramic so much, because of the fact that not much like Sirkap, Iconum has not given us so much of variety in. We have like wine distillation thing, glass bowls. Lot of glass bowls have been found from Iconum. So the use of the technique of making glasses were known. So these are the things that we can understand. So there is one volume by Claude Repa where he talks about the technologies and all thing. I think Mahalakshmi, that would help if you. But unfortunately, most of these volumes are in French. But now some are being translated, but not much.
Somrita asked that, is there any archaeological work on women's life in these cities?
No, unfortunately, no. Actually, the problem is the we are limited by our sources. We do not have women. One can reconstruct women only through some jewelries or through some things, but not. But beyond that, we can't do anything. We don't have, because their problem is that these regions, when in other parts of Indian we had so much of donative records, like for them Sachi and Bharat in 2nd century BC, you have so much of donative records, you have so much of material which you can talk about the people. In these areas you do not find that. This is very strange, but you do not have. Again, as I mentioned that we are talking of strong Hellenistic elements. We have in Sirkap the toilet trays. We don't have toilet trays in Iconum. Not a single toilet tray has been found. But we know that toilet trays were used in Egypt, in Hellenic Egypt and all. So you have this kind of different kinds of things that were happening. And it's very different material. Art historically also, we do not have much like Gandhar art is different, but that is much beyond my period. Gandhar art, but if you look at the Indo-Greek period, we do not have much anything to construct upon.
Yeah, so there's this question by Rohan Nautiyal. He asks that, did these Hellenistic influences spread to the Indo-Gangetic plains as well?
Some, like not much, but we have, for example, we have this use of the word Yavani means writing of the Greeks, huh? Or they are some people say Yavanika, but I'm not very sure. There is a debate also. Maybe in some words, what is there is that what is very interesting also to see is that Alexander is not recorded in any of our texts, Brahmanical texts or anything. So this is very strange. And we have only reference to Menander from the Yoga Purana of the Gargi Sanhita, which talks about the invasion of Menander. But if we try to understand, like in the Greek influence in those areas in the Ganga Valley, unfortunately, we don't have much. Only the script, like for example, in the Kushan period also, when the Kushans were negating the Greek language, when Kanishka said that he doesn't want to use, he was using the Bactrian language, but the script used was Greek. So the Central Asian forces, even the Hunas were using Greek script, much more cursive, but Greek. So the Greek script stayed away for a long time, but it is only with the Central Asian groups, not with the locals.
So this will be the last question for today's session by Shaukat Mukhopadhyay. His question is, ma'am, do you have mentioned about the importance of gymnasium in the Hellenistic culture? In fact, in Ichanum, there was a gymnasium too, as you mentioned. So, was there any pattern behind the prosperities of those gymnasiums?
Looks like that there has to be, but these were all done by the, because we have the big statues like of what is at Hermes and Heracles, then you were dedications of the inscriptions. So these people, they were patrons. So it's not that the gymnasium was made, but it's not that the ruler was only using it. So it was for the common people. So this elites perhaps they dedicated this like they're talking about two brothers, Tibalus and Straton. So it must have been, they must have been the sons of some elite, perhaps they died unfortunately, and then their father dedicates this in the gymnasium. So of course there has to be patrons other than the rulers.
Yeah. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this
Okay,
wonderful
thank you very
session
much.
and
And I
this
thank
discussion.
all of you who have very patiently waited and listened to me. Thank you very much. And it was really a pleasure. Thank you, Ishan, for
Thank you.
inviting me. And I'm really grateful to you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who joined us live this evening. Bye.
Bye.